If you've been to the movies in the last couple of years, you've probably noticed some new features, like 19+ VIP, reserved seating, 3D, time play, IMAX, 70mm, high frame rate, Blu-ray offerings, and whatever the hell AVX is. All of these gimmicks are designed to boost the apparently decreasing number of people attending theaters, though if you go to any Marvel movie opening weekend, you'll have a hard time believing that movie theaters are in trouble at all. We've definitely seen an influx in gimmicky offerings from movie theaters in the past couple of years, but we're nowhere near peak gimmick. That title goes to the 1950s. The big kicker for these gimmicks was a 1948 Supreme Court ruling in the United States that forced all the major studios to separate their production and distribution, meaning that companies like Paramount Pictures and 20th Century Fox had to sell their theater chains. Since they could no longer block book a year's worth of movies into theaters and they had to sell movies to theaters individually and not just force them to take whatever they made, they became more selective with the films they chose to produce, pouring more money into the production and marketing of fewer films. This is where the gimmicks come in. One of the first major gimmicks was 3D. The 50s wasn't when 3D was invented, but it certainly went through a wave of popularity with titles like Buona Devil from 1952 and Man in the Dark from 1953 and House of Wax, the first color 3D film, which debuted just 2 days later. Buona Devil, which many agree is responsible for kicking off the wave of 3D films in the 1950s, was received in a similar fashion to Avatar, which was responsible for kicking off the current wave of 3D films. Life magazine wrote that Buona Devil did achieve some striking three-dimensional sequences, but members of the audience reported that the glasses were uncomfortable and that the film itself was dull. Sound familiar? The man who really started off the whole wild gimmick scene was horror film director and marketing genius William Castle. In 1958, he released Macabre, but to get people buzzing about it, he took out a $1,000 insurance policy to be paid to the families of anyone who died whilst watching the movie.
Bring someone with you to see this motion picture. You'll want some live hands to hold during the performance. And you won't want to go home alone after it's finished, if you're able to go home.
The stunt worked, with the ploy appearing in newspapers across the country, and it was quick to become the 7th biggest box office hit for the year.
Don't worry about being scared to death. Your heirs will collect after you've gone.
Today, cinemas are trying to convince teenagers to go to theaters to watch movies that they could easily watch on their iPads, and the goal in the 1950s was oddly similar, except that the teenage market was a brand new idea at that time, so it wasn't about trying to convince teenagers to come back, but to go in the first place. Castle was all over this. His strategy was to tell teens that his movies were not for their parents. In his, you could scream and yell and take part in what wasn't just a movie, but an interactive experience.
And for the first time in motion picture history, members of the audience, including you, will actually play a part in the picture.
In 1959, Castle released The Tingler, another horror film starring Vincent Price about a parasite that makes people's spines tingle when they're scared. Castle employed a gimmick for this film called Percepto, which sounds fun, but it's actually horrifying. Castle installed electric buzzers or shockers into some of the seats in the theater that would buzz or shock the audience members at particularly scary moments throughout the film. That is literally my nightmare. In his 1961 film Homicidal, just before the horrific climax, he inserted a countdown clock accompanied by a heartbeat and Castle's voice prompting any audience members who were too scared to leave the theater and get their money back before the super scary finale.
This is the fright break. You hear that sound? It's the sound of a heartbeat. A frightened, terrified heart. Is it beating faster than your heart or slower? This heart is going to beat for another 25 seconds to allow anyone to leave this theater who is too frightened to see the end of the picture. 10 seconds more and we go into the house. It's now or never. 5, 4, you're a brave audience. 2, 1.
Upon leaving, the theatergoers would have to walk down an aisle marked "Cowards Keep Walking," past the nurse who would offer to take your blood pressure while the stereo blared a recording of "Watch the Chicken. Watch him shiver in the coward's corner." Once you got to said corner, you had to sign a yellow certificate saying you were a bona fide coward before getting your money back. Castle's 1961 Mr. Sardonicus featured an interactive voting system called a punishment poll, in which audience members could vote on mercy or punishment for the villain, providing 2 different endings.
Hold the ballots high, please. The lady in the 9th row, a little higher. The little boy in the back, will you please sit down so I can count the cards behind you? Mercy, no mercy. 17, you carry the 3. No mercy. So be it. Mr. Projectionist, let the sentence be carried out.
Though there is some skepticism about the existence of said alternate ending. Castle had a lot of awesomely silly gimmicks, like throwing a skeleton over the audience, ghosts you could only see through one lens of a pair of 3D glasses.
Wowee! Do you have trouble seeing ghosts? Of course you do, unless you have these special ghost viewers.
And he even had one film that advertised the requirement of a seatbelt, because it was so scary that people would want to run away. The post-Castle era of gimmicky cinema is mostly just lackluster marketing ploys with very little follow-through. Except for Aromorama, and Smell-O-Vision, and Odorama. All of which, as you can probably guess, are smell-based technologies. Aromorama debuted in 1959 with Behind the Great Wall, and he used the building's AC to pump scents into the theaters. It was able to disperse and substitute new smells every 90 seconds. According to an article in Films in Review from 1960, they didn't take full advantage of the smells that might be different in the film's setting, China, and instead just pumped in pleasant and neutral smells. Very exciting. The aptly named Scented Mystery would be the one and only film to debut with the competing technology Smell-O-Vision in 1960. It involved a series of tubing, a mile's worth at Chicago's Cinestage Theater, that released different smells from under the theatergoers' seats triggered by cues on the film's soundtrack. Unlike Behind the Great Wall, where odor was an afterthought, in Scent of Mystery, odor was a key proponent for uncovering the film's villain. Both of these technologies would flop, but they would be semi-resurrected 20 years later with a technology called Odorama, which debuted in polyester in 1981, which used scratch and sniff cards in combination with the most I've ever seen actors smell things ever.
This will make you...
Smelling is believing. While most of these wacky marketing gimmicks didn't have much of a lasting impact on the film industry as a whole, some of them would go on to become staples. As television became the #1 deal in the 1950s, less and less people were attending theaters, so Hollywood responded by offering something that audiences couldn't get on TV: widescreen. In 1952, the widescreen technology Cinerama debuted and became quite successful before being replaced by the much cheaper CinemaScope. Widescreen technology had been around since before the 1950s, but it was always very expensive and difficult to do. Another staple today that started as a gimmick is surround sound, which debuted in 1941 in Disney's Fantasia. It was created because Walt Disney wanted the bees in The Flight of the Bumblebee to sound like they were flying around in the theater, and so Fantasound was born. But probably more interesting is Sensurround, a surround sound system that debuted alongside the 1974 film Earthquake. It was basically a system of massive speakers that were loud enough to vibrate the entire theater at action-packed moments. But even before the 1950s, filmmakers and theaters were using gimmicks to attract audiences to their films. What many consider to be the first film is Louis Le Prince's Roundhay Garden scene from 1888. And not but 5 years later, William Friese Greene would file a patent for a 3D cinema process that involved audiences watching 3D movies through a clunky stereoscopic headset. Stereoscopic 3D not only predates sound and color in film, but it actually entirely predates the motion picture itself, with the first stereoscopic 3D device invented in 1838 for still photographs. In 1915, probably the first public screening of a 3D movie would take place, with Jim the Penman, and by 1922, filmmakers were getting more creative with the use of the red and green glasses. The Power of Blood premiered in theaters in Los Angeles in 1922, and it not only has 3D, but it also had alternate endings, which you could choose by looking through either the red or green lens of your glasses. It's funny and I guess telling that the reviews of 3D film in the 20s are very similar to the reviews of 3D film today. The 1922 3D film Man from Mars was described by the editor of Film Daily as resulting in trifling eye strain, and that one is inclined to become a bit stiff through remaining in one position. For one of the first big releases of a 3D film using the Teleview technology, it didn't help that the movie itself wasn't very good. The New York Times described it as being drawn out to a tedious length and burdened with much dreary humor. D.W. Griffith, nicknamed the inventor of Hollywood, when asked about 3D films, quite accurately predicted the future of the technology, saying that there would be a period of preparation, which will take many months, if not years. I'm still going through that. Sound has always been tied to the idea of motion pictures. It just took a while to figure out the logistics. In 1888, Thomas Edison and Edward Muybridge met and discussed the possibility of merging their two technologies: Muybridge's Zoopraxiscope, an early motion picture device, and Edison's phonograph, an early audio device, with the hopes of syncing sound and motion for the first time. Edison would move forward on his own, creating the cabinet motion picture and sound device called the Kinetophone in 1899. A year later at the Paris Expo, the dream would be more fully realized with the Phono Cinema Theater, the world's first in-theater movie with sound. But there were three major problems. The sound was usually out of sync, the audio wasn't loud enough, remember this is in the days before electric amplification, and the quality of the audio wasn't very good.
A few brief years ago, Mr. Thomas A. Edison presented to the world the kinetoscope. Inventors the world over have endeavored to synchronize the phonograph and motion picture.
Directors could only get decent audio if the actors or musicians were right next to the large and cumbersome microphones. Which works if you're making a movie like In a World, but I feel like if you released In a World in the year 1900, all the humor would be lost.
This Wednesday, one woman will teach another woman to sound a little less.
Can I get a smoothie around here?
I don't know where you'd get a smoothie around here at all. I'm so sorry.
Oh, okay. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Over the next few years, advancements would be made with technologies like the chronophonograph, the camera phone, no not that one, the cinephone, and more. None of these technologies would take off, and for a long time, silent films were often accompanied by live sound effects, orchestrations, singers, and sometimes even live voice actors. By 1927, they had figured out the sound sync, amplification, and fidelity issues with the world's first feature-length talkie, The Jazz Singer.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am privileged to say a few words to you in this most modern and novel manner. Privileged because it's the first living Vitaphone announcement ever made announcing the coming of one of the year's outstanding pictures. Warner Brothers' supreme triumph, Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer. Now, this picture with Vitaphone accompaniment and Al Jolson singing many of his songs in his own inimitable manner is a big hit in New York.
To accomplish this, they used Vitaphone, which was a sound-on-disc system, basically syncing up the film with a phonograph record. They would soon learn to print audio on film. Next up, color. It was always possible to make color films, it's just that most of the processes were incredibly labor-intensive and required a factory assembly line-like workflow of painting color onto each individual frame. The real game was trying to figure out how to automate that process. The first successful of these automations was Kinemacolor, which was invented in 1906. It involved shooting at double the standard frame rate at the time, so 32 frames per second, through rotating green and red filters, and then projecting it at 16 frames per second, also through a red and green filter that would alternate every other frame. Kinemacolor would soon die out due to high projector costs and would eventually be replaced by Technicolor in 1916, which began as a process of filtering light through prisms and colored filters onto black and white film and eventually evolved into a 3-strip film process, each strip capturing a different color before being mixed together. Technicolor ended up winning because unlike Kinemacolor, it didn't cost theaters any extra money to install. Color film in its earlier days was met with mixed reviews. In 1929, Rupert Hughes wrote for The Guardian, "I view the prospect of color with more alarm than I ever did the advent of sound. There will be so little left to imagine." Color was particularly gimmicky because it wasn't often used throughout the film in the same way that sound was. The Wizard of Oz used color to contrast the magic land of Oz and the dreary Kansas. Irene used it only in the musical sequences to bring them more to life, and the battle scenes in Task Force are the most realistic because they're the only ones to feature color. Today we don't only have fancy reserved seating, but movie gimmicks have evolved into underground marketing campaigns, which are arguably way cooler. The viral campaign for The Dark Knight included a series of websites, including a fictional version of the Gotham Times, a Joker version of the Gotham Times, the Ha 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 Times, I Believe in Harvey Dent website, and more. But it gets way more interesting. On December 3rd, 2007, a new page popped up on whysoserious.com, containing a bunch of teddy bears which had addresses on them. The site told users to go to said address and say their name was Robin Banks. Very clever. Turns out all the addresses were bakeries, and if you say the right name, you get a special cake with a phone number on it, and inside the cake was a Gotham City evidence bag containing a cell phone, a charger, a Joker playing card, and a note with instructions to call the number on the cake from the phone. The call went to a rent-a-clown business, and the woman working there said she knew whoever the caller was. The caller then got a text message saying, "Good work, clown. Keep this phone charged and with you at all times. Don't call me. I will call you. Eventually." That was my best Joker.
Hello, I'm Harvey Dent, Assistant District Attorney of Gotham City. I'm calling to ask for your support.
It makes sense that film and theater owners have used gimmicks to sell films since there were films to sell. Since films started out as a technological gimmick, it's only logical that they'd want to add more to that experience. Whether it's color or sound or 3D or shocking people in their seats or getting them to dig through cakes, for better or for worse, gimmicks are alive and well in Hollywood. What do you guys think? Do you love 3D? Or do you just want it to stop? Or what's your favorite movie gimmick? Let me know in the comments, and all of the things that I talked about in this video are hard to do justice to in a 10-ish minute video. So if you want to learn anything else, I posted some great links to articles and books and stuff in the description. If you want to click here, you can go check me out on Patreon and support me there, which would be much appreciated. If you haven't already, be sure to click right on my face to subscribe, or at least think about it.